Hello and welcome to Florida Gators Live, episode 71, presented by FanDuel. Plenty for us to get to tonight, even though it has been a bit of a slow week on the football front in terms of news. Obviously, players are on spring break right now, so they have not been around practicing for the last week or so, still not in town. So kind of will be a little bit of time before we, see more clips from practice, get a little bit more insights there from the coaching staff, but we still got a lot to talk about, some recruiting. We'll continue our previews with the defensive line, and we'll get into, previewing some March Madness action because we now have a bracket, and Florida did in fact earn the number one seed, despite kind of a lackluster showing in Nashville at the SEC tournament last week. So we'll get into that. A lot to talk about. But Max, how excited are you for March Madness? It's obviously kicked off last night officially with the first four, two more games going on tonight, including one that will determine Florida's first round opponent.
Yeah, no, I'm extremely excited. March Madness, one of my favorite times of the year. So I'm sure everybody else filled out their brackets and is, anticipating. Obviously, the Gators looking to go back to back and make that run. Um, you know, they'd be the first team to go back to back in 2 years because UConn just did it. But it'd be pretty crazy if just two teams, 4 seasons. But Florida has their work cut out for them, and we'll go into that later. But like you mentioned, a little slow on the football front as of now. But yeah, that gives us an opportunity to kind of dive in more to the recruiting trail and also into the defensive line, which I think is a very interesting position group. And with the change in Florida's defensive scheme, definitely going to be intriguing to watch.
Yeah, it certainly will be a lot to talk about. I'm excited to preview it, kind of get thoughts on where the team stands and what if all changed from, what we saw this past weekend in Nashville. But before we do that, I think we should maybe start off with some recruiting news, as we've kind of been doing here these last few weeks. Now, Florida, we've talked quite a bit about, talked about 5 stars with Florida, looking to potentially land Maxwell Hiller. We've talked about a pair of receivers last week who recently received predictions to go to Florida. Now we're talking about what would be a pretty colossal flip if this staff could actually pull it off. That is, of course, Easton Royal, 5-star receiver from New Orleans. He's a top 10 player nationally, number 2 receiver in the class per the 247 Sports Composite. Currently committed to Texas, where he scheduled an official visit. Already has one scheduled for Florida as well. We talked about that a few weeks ago when we previewed those guys. But I mean, obviously would be a really significant get. He was just on campus last week for an unofficial visit, and he kind of made some pretty revealing comments to the media after that visit, especially, just it sounds like this new coaching staff has made an impression. He said, and I quote, "The energy in the building is completely different." So I am curious, Max, like, was this a flip target that was even really on your radar as a competitive battle? Because it really wasn't for me.
Yeah, I mean, when we talked about it a couple weeks ago, this was a guy we said, well, he's a really explosive player, but a guy who commits to Texas, obviously, we've spoken at length at the NIL situation there compared to Florida, and I'm sure he has a really good offer from Texas. Um, but Florida showed last season they're willing to get true freshman receivers involved, and I think they're going to show that again this season in one way or another. And then you look at Royal and the teams he's looking at, and outside of Texas, like obviously like Tennessee's another big program, and so is Ole Miss, but they're not like Georgia or they're not like Oregon, like these gigantic spenders. Like, of course, they're spending, but they're spending at the level Florida's spending. So I think it kind of talks a lot about Royal's desire and what he's looking for in a school. And, he really enjoyed his time at Florida this week. He talked about the practice he went to right before the team went on break and like said, like, it was a really fun practice. Like the energy was crazy. Like the coaches were giving energy the whole time. The players were giving energy the whole time. And like He said Florida's offense looks like a fun one to watch this season, which we've talked about. I think they're going to look fun too. And like he also talked about how like the coaching staff was really transparent in like, okay, this is what you're going to see in practice, like, and that's what he saw. Like they're not giving him any BS. Like what he's seeing is the real deal, and they're not just sprucing it up for him because he's visiting. Like this is what it's going to look like, and I think that says a lot. I think recruits can kind of tell when you're being a little disingenuous or you're not giving them the real thing. Like they want to see the real thing. They want to see where you're going to be. So I think that Royal is definitely a possibility. And I wouldn't have said that a month ago, like you said. And like Texas is still the leader here. Like he said, like there's still a huge gap to make up because Texas has my commitment. But that's not I'm for sure staying at Texas. Obviously he's going on these visits. He's hearing out other programs. So I wouldn't be shocked if he does flip. Do I think it's really likely? I don't know. There's really no way to know because he's being open, but obviously like he's being as open as he can be without going, well, I don't know if, I'm going here or I'm not. So again, another 5-star player that Florida's going after before John Summerall's team even plays a game. He's impressing these recruits. He's doing a great job on the trail. And I just think it speaks to the staff and what they're going to do.
Yeah, 100%. I think, I agree. I think, he made it pretty clear he's still completely into Texas. But I mean, I shouldn't say completely locked because I think he's obviously not 100% locked because, like you said, still taking visits elsewhere, still have official visits lined up to Tennessee and Florida. Maybe, we'll see if he adds another one or two in there. But, obviously a guy who's still at least hearing out some other programs. But I mean, I agree. I think the kind of underlying theme with all these guys who it's kind of remains to be seen whether Florida will actually get, but they seem to be in at least a semi-decent position for, some more than others. But I think the underlying theme seems to be that these guys are just really impressed with what they've seen from the new staff, because again, it's mostly sight unseen in terms of the football product. They don't really know what that's going to look like yet. Obviously, I think this one's significant going after a guy who's committed to Texas, because I think it kind of reminds me of the conversation we had a few weeks ago about Florida's NIL, where we came to the conclusion that it's not by any means in a dire spot, but you're also not really positioned to, compete with teams like Texas or Miami, in terms of, devolves into a bidding war. That out here. Sorry, but it seems to me that, at least Florida's willing to compete there. Isn't the biggest motivating factor for a guy like Easton Royal. But either way, I think you got to be, pretty impressed by between, this and obviously the smoke with Maxwell Hiller, like a couple guys that, I don't think Florida, many people thought Florida was going to even really have a shot at a few months ago. But just speaks to the work the staff has done and what is really, when you think about it, a pretty short amount of time.
Yeah, we lost you for a second there, but I know you were saying
okay.
that in that part though, you were saying like what this coaching staff, like proof of concept wise, like what they've still kind of been able to do, and that's just I think speaks to what the staff is going for and the aspirations they have. Because John Summerall came in and was like, we're not just talking about getting this team better. Like we want to be competing for national championships. And that's the goal. Like that's what this program should be at. So, and he's staying true to that and how he's recruiting going against Texas. I mean, what a gut punch it would be for Texas. They've gotten gut punched a couple times by Florida in the last year, regardless of sport, regardless of game, recruiting, whatever it will be. Florida's had Texas's number. So, whether it be with the guys who stayed at Florida or, in basketball or in the swamp last year. So, yeah, that would be a big gut punch. So again, right now it's just wait and see with Royal. His official visits, I'm sure he's not committing anywhere before those are done. But, he has the official visits. He's going to Tennessee, then back to Gainesville, and then to Austin. Right now, those are his three that are scheduled. I mean, and like I mentioned earlier, LSU and Ole Miss are the other two teams still in the conversation here, it looks like. So, one way or another, he's going to be either lining up against Florida or lining up with Florida in SEC play. This is an SEC player. So, uh, and it's not hard to see why when it's a guy who averaged more than 20 yards per catch and had 17 touchdowns last year and is 6 foot 200. I mean, what else do you want the guy to do? As a junior in high school, that's pretty much exactly what you're asking for, and he did it. So there's a reason this is a top 10 player. And, imagine a world where he comes to Florida, Maxwell Howard comes to Florida, and we're talking about two of the top 10 recruits in the country committing to Florida in the same cycle with a coach who hasn't even coached a game yet at Florida. I mean, that would be, we're reaching a little here. Obviously, that we're still a ways away, but it's more possible than I think we would have thought it was a month ago. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that would obviously be extremely impressive if that does come to pass. But it is just interesting because, again, when all the things that people said about this staff coming in, maybe except for Troutwine, because he is kind of known as a recruiter, but like that wasn't really what they talked about with John Summerall. They talked about his passion, his, ability for roster building, kind of instilling the toughness and toss about the recruiting. And it was just kind of unknown because it's really hard to compare, G5 recruiting, especially like at a place like Tulane where, they have a lot of money relative to the average G5 school. Like for them, recruiting is, for a G5 school, at least, pretty straightforward. Still not getting prospects. So there's, I think, a lot of questions to answer. Still a lot of questions to answer because they only have 3 guys in the class. And, a lot of these guys that have received projections have not actually committed yet. So, this has a lot to prove in that regard. I will say this is something we talked about last week too, when we talked about the other receivers that Florida had received predictions for. I mean, it is just fascinating how much the staff seems to value. Like, yep, we'll take a receiver we can get. You're a good receiver. You're a good receiver. We want you. Approach portal cycle. They landed 4. They were in the mix for way more than that. Obviously, you're not going to get everyone you're in the mix for, but there were a lot of guys that kicked the tires on. That seems to be the case in this recruiting class as well. I mean, just in terms of previewing official visits, talking about these predictions and, guys like, a guy like Easton Royal. I mean, how many receivers have we talked about that are just 2027 guys? I mean, 7, 8, something like that. I mean, there's a lot that Florida is, again, at least having conversations with. And I think that it's hard for me to not think that's by design and something that, Buster Faulkner's like, I want versatility in the receiving game. So, that is just a very interesting trend, especially because I think especially when Summerall got hired, I'm not sure anyone thought like this is going to be a receiver heavy team, pass game heavy team, but that seems to be the way they want to build it.
I think that's where we're trending long term. Obviously this season with Jaden Bond, we've talked about how this offense is going to run through him in a lot of aspects, but they still want to throw the ball and stretch the field. And that's the long-term goal. Also, I think the other thing about receivers comparatively to other positions when you're recruiting them is the versatility to also play special teams and be core special teamers collegiately because of the kinds of athletes they are. You're getting guys who are like, if they're playing receiver in high school, they're seen as probably one of the best players on their high school team, right? The receiver position is really coveted in high school. It's a passing game now, especially in the high school level. So unless you have a dominant running back like a Derrick Henry, but like those don't grow on trees. But 5'11", 190 guys who are quick, they're not the hardest thing to find in a good area. So I think having that special teams versatility as well, it could be part of the reason. that Florida is so heavily going after receivers and also the offensive scheme as a whole. But Royal, I mean, when you talk 5 stars, we're talking guys that are instant impact players and are just going to come in and do what they need to do and be electric playmakers. And that's the expectation for a guy like Easton Royal. Wherever he ends up, he's going to play that role. Hopefully, it's at Florida. I think he'd be a really fun player to follow over the next couple seasons and see him grow, because this is obviously a guy with all the traits to be a really, really, really good receiver for a long time.
Certainly. Obviously a bit ambitious, as we've said. He's committed to Texas currently. And they've got a decent track record with receivers under Sarkisian. So certainly not by any means a given that Florida's going to flip him, but they do seem to be pushing, seem to be at least in the mix, under consideration. I mean, we'll see how things go at his official visit in June. We'll see how things go, going into the season. I think that's the wild card that I think is interesting, because like if Florida comes out and has a successful season, what happens with some of these guys who were on maybe did see a little more proof of concept. I think that would be really interesting to see. But obviously, recruitment, it is open, but it's not wide open in the sense that he is already committed to a big time program. So, the staff's work is cut out for them, but I think obviously it would be a tremendous early win, as would Maxwell Hiller and some of the other guys that we talked about before, has made. So even though Florida's spring practice is on a bit of a hole right now, as they're on spring, we have plenty about it. Continuing with our positional previews, which is the title of the show, we'll talk about Florida's defensive line, which, I mean, I think, we talked about one of my bigger question marks last week in terms of the offensive line. I think the defensive line is up there too, more so from a depth perspective than a top end perspective. I think at the top end, Florida probably has enough pieces to give you something, but I think there's a lot of questions and everything else. So, I mean, I think we can start off. I guess we'll talk about, because we're including the edges, the jacks, in this defensive line group rather than when we talk about the linebackers next week. So I think we'll just talk about this biggest win on defense this offseason, which is retaining Jaden Woods. Obviously, a crazy production as a freshman, but given the fact that he was really mostly a rotational player for, early until, kind of midway through the season when he started seeing a lot of playing time, but finished with 3.5 sacks, 27 total tackles. Obviously commanded a lot of money had he stayed in the transfer portal like he was originally planning, before manages to get him back. I mean, do you see him as the anchor for this position group this year?
Absolutely. If you look behind him on the players they have in the jack room, it's not like the most loaded positional group. Like if Woods was gone, this would be a huge point of concern, I think, because behind him you've got Kofi Asare, who showed some flashes last year, and potentially LJ McCray, maybe. We'll talk about him in a little bit, because he's one of the players I'm very interested in this season. But yeah, Jaden Woods. So from a production standpoint, I mean, it was a great freshman season. He had 3.5 sacks and played every game. But physically, I mean, this is just a guy who's just going to get better and better because of his physicality. He's just now getting to the point where he can focus more on the technique and focus just solely in this jack position, really as just a pass rusher. I mean, of course, he's going to be defending the run, but he's really going to be out there like getting after the quarterback. That's going to be what he's asked to do. This guy has all the physical traits to be an elite pass rusher, not only in college, but on the next level. Like this is a professional player based on his attitude, his work ethic. This is a professional. So even just the way he talks, like how he talked about his decision and his thought process in staying at Florida, like it was a very mature way to think about it. Like, he wanted to make sure he was making the right decision for himself and for his future. And he wanted to have those conversations with Florida staff before he committed to staying. And obviously, he ended up feeling comfortable in doing so. And, Bam Hardman, the outside linebackers coach, who's going to be doing most of the Jack stuff. So I know it's kind of funny we're grouping them in with the D line. But when you think pass rusher, I always think defensive lineman usually. Um, he said he thinks the sky's the limit for a guy like Jaden Woods, and it's really hard to not feel the same way. Um, so behind, God forbid, but if injuries were to happen, that would be a huge concern. But the way he physically prepares himself, he's built to withstand a 12 game season of college football and into the postseason because his strength, the way he takes care of himself, he's a consummate professional and he's 19 years old. So it's really impressive how he handles himself and how he carries himself on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's a lot of people are putting on this guy early on because, again, he really was kind of a rotational player until the latter half of the season last year, but showed enough, sparks, I guess, that he'd be the best player on this defense this year. I mean, I think not a lot of returning production here. You bring back a few key players and we'll talk about, some of those in the weeks to come. But I think one of the few pieces on the defense where you can just, I think, pretty confidently say, I feel good about what the Gators have at this spot. But I think elsewhere on the defensive line, I think Cam James, who's going to see a bigger role this year than he did last season, I think that's a pretty solid piece. Like, I think a guy that maybe hasn't gotten his due just because there's been other pieces. But I mean, he co-led the team in sacks last year with Jaden Woods with 3.5, 44 tackles in total. I think he's been a good player, during his time here. And I'm excited to see, him getting a little bit more responsibility this year as it kind of seems like we're shaping up to get.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he's one of the leaders of this D line. I mean, he's pretty much the longest tenured playing defensive lineman on this team. A guy who's consistently seen playing time over, 2 seasons for sure, and a little bit of a third. So, and while the production's not off the charts, a lot of that is Florida is losing their 2 most veteran edge rushers, and in Tyreek Sapp and George Gums, 2 guys going in the NFL. But I think James can kind of pencil in for a little bit of the production they're leaving. I mean, it wasn't much sack production last season, and that's something I think this defense is going to look to have more of is sack production. It's not great when at the end of the season, 3.5 leads your team. That's, ideally you want a guy getting 5 sacks at least. I mean, that shows you've got a pass rusher you have to worry about. And they had that in Tyreek Sapp 2 years ago. We didn't have that last season. So Cam James could potentially be in the mix for that. A very functionally sound player, strong guy, and someone who's going to be a leader of this positional group and have that responsibility. And I feel better about the depth on the D line itself and in behind Cam James. Emmanuel, I'm gonna butcher it. Oibadejo. I did
I'm
my
glad
best.
you tried it before I did because I was worrying about
I'm
attempting that.
gonna refer to him as Emmanuel. He is a large
Yeah.
human being. He is gigantic, and he's really good. Like, that was a big get in the portal from Jacksonville State, and he's being put in a role where he is going to rotate, and I think that's going to help because I think it's going to allow him to be effective whenever he's in the game with that strength and that sneaky athleticism that he has to make plays. So I think him and Cam James are really your 2 guys to watch in that D end group. And so is LJ McCray. And I'll go into LJ McCray now because I brought it up a little bit earlier. And, while it's fresh in my mind, LJ McCray came into Gainesville really highly touted. This was a guy who people were expecting to emerge as one of the better defensive linemen in the country at some point in his collegiate career. Freshman year, growing pains, that happens. And then obviously with the injury last year, he basically didn't play last year. Basically is an understatement. He didn't play last year. So he comes in, and this is a really crucial year for him because it's like, okay, like, are you going to live up to the stars? I thought what Brad White and Gerald Chapman said about him early, like Chapman said, like he's going through the process of changing his body in the weight room and I think becoming more versatile as a player. And then like Brad White said weeks later, now the commitment that McCray has had into changing his body has been super encouraging. He's really impressed by what he's done. And he's getting stronger. There's still progress. He said he has to make, but Brad White said if he's gonna roll and be good to go and a player on this team, like that's a huge asset. So I'm not discounting LJ McCray showing off his skill this season because we know he has it. It's just, can he put himself in the position? Can he earn the reps? I think a lot of these guys are going to be rotating because you talked about it, like the lack of sure things depth-wise here. So I think we're going to see a lot of rotation. Like these guys are going to be playing 60% of snaps at best, your starters, like if that. So because you've got like 7 guys or 6 or 7 guys, no pun intended, that can actually probably see the field this season on the defensive line for 3 spots. So it'll be interesting. And then like Jalen Wiggins, another guy with some hype coming in last year, maybe makes a couple appearances. And we'll get to like the real interior in a second. But with Cam James, Emmanuel, and LJ McCray, you just need one of them to like be solid. And I think if you're rotating the 3 of them, that's a solid football player. They all do things well. And I think they all can cover up each other's weaknesses and play them situationally. And whoever plays the best, you play him. That's football. Whoever's the best player gets the playing time.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective. I mean, I think that's a good point. I think all of them have potential. I think all of them have potential skill sets that could be maximized. I think talking about LJ, like again, I think is surprising to an extent. Just haven't seen how he has materialized. I mean, obviously he was a guy that never won here. It just hasn't exactly panned out for a number of reasons. I think for reasons, for injury reasons. I mean, I am curious because I saw those quotes that you referenced. When kind of to me, these guys seem to think that when they got here that LJ had a lot of work to do. And it seems that they still do, but maybe he's making progress. But I think that was also kind of telling in its own way. A lot of the quotes were like about the progress to make, going into year 3.
Kind of lost you a lot on that. I'm not gonna.
Okay, sorry about that.
I got what you said. All right, I'm just gonna go here. So what Tyler asked was a lot of the questions regarding LJ McCray were about the process, and there's still work to do. That's absolutely true. This is not a guy who has really proven anything, and I think there was issues with his body type. Recently, I think his body was a big question, and I know that's kind of what you're asking about the process of that, and figuring out, body wise, can he get to a point where he could be an effective player? Because he always had an interesting build because he was like too big to be an edge, but too small to be a true defensive lineman. And he was kind of in that tweener position in the 4-3, especially because in the 4-3, you want your guys on those outsides to not be super heavy. But then on the interior, like you do. But in a 3-4 on this D line spot, he could kind of mold his body to play that position in a better way. And I think that's the process, and I think he knows he could do that and affect this team because, like we talked about, there isn't really much depth in the jack spot. So if he drops some weight to like 255, like he could play in that jack spot absolutely as a rotational guy, and rush the passer, and I think that would add a lot to his game as well. So definitely a lot of work for him still to do, and they haven't put on the pads yet. They're doing that when they get back for break, and we'll see how he does with the pads on. That will tell us a lot, and I'm sure we'll speak about it more this summer on where McCray is at. But this is the most positive this coaching staff has sounded about him since he got to UF. And it takes time for different players, but I think he's finally in the mental mind space of, okay, this is what I need to do if I'm going to get playing time.
Yeah, totally. Can you hear me better now? Am I coming through all right?
A little bit. The audio's not too bad. We're getting there.
Well, we'll try to power through it. Sorry, guys, some internet issues over here. I mean, yeah, with LJ, I think that's a really good beat that I think, especially in the old team, he was a bit of a twinner and just didn't fit a role perfectly. I think that could be something you see improvement on this team. Obviously, a guy you can't forget about, but I think also a guy that could, get surpassed by some other pieces that, we haven't seen as much of, from a depth perspective. So I think he's got, a lot to prove this year. I think Emmanuel was really interesting, obviously kind of a guy who's like new to football. He's from England, but really productive last season, had 4.5 sacks, so higher sacks than anyone on Gators team last year. Yeah, I mean, crazy frame, 6'6", like that is not, you see a lot of, along the defensive line. So really intriguing. I mean, I think to me, he's a guy that he certainly is going to push Cam.
Nope. We had a good run. Yeah, like he was saying, he's going to push Cam James. Emmanuel is, because of his physicality and because of the player he is at that frame and with that production and that skill set. So, yeah, Tyler, I was just picking up where you left off with that, but I know where you were going. That he could definitely push for some like legit playing time on the outside. We could go into the interior a little because there's two spots, like the nose and D tackle spot, and like to me, there's 5 players that I think could compete for those 2 spots. 4 of them with more of an inside track, and 1 guy, a transfer portal addition, who I think is just more of a depth player. But Jamari Lyons on the nose, he had to step up at points last season. And then you've got Brendan Bett, who I know that name might, when you hear that name, a lot of Gators fans just think of the USF game. But he quietly had a pretty good season. Like he was really consistent. And people make mistakes. Like, yes, if he doesn't take that penalty, do the Gators have a better shot at winning that game? Yes. But, like, who knows? They could have just still gone down. They still had to go down and get more yards. That wasn't just it. So I think people make mistakes. It was early in the season. He showed he could rebound from that and into a good season. And then you've got Joseph Mbachu and Jeremiah McLeod as 2 guys that I think are really interesting players that got to see the field a lot last season, when honestly they probably didn't expect that, because the expectation going into last season was that Caleb Banks was obviously going to be the guy in this room, and obviously that didn't happen because of injury. So that guys had to step up, including, Mekhi Burrow, who obviously departed in the portal, which was a really big loss. But retaining Ibatu and retaining McLeod, you've got two guys that I think are good enough and have certain traits that make them interesting players that can play a role. Because that's kind of the overwhelming thing I feel about this defensive line group as a whole. And I think you'd agree with me here. Outside of the jack position, it's not about the individual players who are getting those starting spots. Like, it's about the rotation of guys and what they all have to offer. And yes, would you wish there's a little more depth here, just in case of injury, because injury sucked in this position group last year? Yes, but you've got to make do with what you've got, and this is what Florida's got.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Down to the rotation, because I mean, I think it's something where you could see a lot of different guys kind of play different, different amounts of reps depending on the game. I think, yeah, it kind of just depends on the situation. Yeah, I mean, I think Bet ended up quietly becoming one of the more consistent players on the defensive line. I agree with you. I think getting him back was a big deal. Lyons, was a guy that last year, when we on this show last year talked about it, obviously we were pretty optimistic about the roster. We were like, the only area where there's like really a question mark is the interior of the defensive line. Lyons was kind of the guy that I expected would step there. Sort of got supplanted a little bit, didn't really have a massive impact. I mean, I think curious to see what we get out. He's been around here. Talk about the longest tenured guys on the team. He's been around here a pretty long time as well. So, curious to see if we can kind of finally get it out of him. But I think, especially, I think this is a spot where we can see depth kind of, and see kind of a bigger role than maybe we're expecting, just because, guys like Mbachu, has shown some promise, like McLeod. I'm interested, DK Kalu from Baylor didn't really play a lot at Baylor last year. So I'm curious to see what he could do here too. So, I mean, I think there's like when we look at the defensive line as a whole, and especially the interior, I think there's promise. I think there's enough pieces here that you could probably convince yourself you're going to scrape together some pretty good defensive line play. But I mean, I do think, there is just a lot that's unproven. And I think that just means there's a high level of variance. Like, I think it could be, I don't think it'll be a disastrous unit, but I think it could be anything from an all right unit to one that's pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, DJ Kalu was the guy I was alluding to earlier as the portal addition. That was more of a depth piece, I think, at least for this season. But because of the lack of depth this unit has, he might be tasked with stepping up into a bigger role out the gate. And we'll see. Like you said, there's a lot of question marks here, kind of like on the offensive line. I mean, I would say there's a teensy bit more experience in this group than on the offensive line, just in like actual game experience recently, but it's close. Like, it's not, like, it's pretty tight in terms of that. So I definitely some concerns. I think you'd be lying to yourself if you were like, yeah, I feel really comfortable about this group. But I think there is talent here. I think this will be a well-coached unit. Obviously, with Gerald Chapman coming back, he was a big priority for John Summerall in terms of retention on the coaching staff. And you can see why. He is a good coach. With what he was tasked with last season, with how banged up this unit was, and they were still pretty productive. I think that speaks a lot to him as a coach. So I'm definitely intrigued in what this group is going to look like and who is going to emerge. Right now, kind of like how I did with the offensive line last week. Like, we know Jaden Wood's at the jack, but I think right now Cam James, Jamari Lyons, and Brendan Bett are your three starters, and then everybody else kind of rotating in on that D-line group.
Yeah, it remains to be seen exactly what it's going to look like. I think potentially a limiting factor for this team, but we'll see. I think this comment that we got earlier, at the top of the show, I think kind of summarizes the optimistic point of view here well, which is we have enough pieces, a good SEC level strength and conditioning program, and good defensive coaching. I mean, I certainly agree with the defensive coach. with the minds in that room between Summerall and Brad White and Gerald Chapman, I think you have to feel pretty good about the fact that they can kind of figure out the best way to utilize all these guys. But, again, things like injuries happen. And I think, if it were in a position where some of these guys who were expecting to play minor roles have to play major roles, that's when you'll really see, at least where this position group is at.
100% agree. And this strength program is way better than it was last year. I'll just tell you that firsthand. Yeah. You don't want to mess with Rusty Witt. That is a tough dude. Like, you could just tell. When he starts calling people by Mr. last name, when he's talking about the players, like, oh, Mr. Ball and Mr. Woods, and shoot, I wouldn't want to mess with that guy. I'll just say that. So I'm glad he's on our side. I think next week we're going to talk about a position group I feel really strongly about, and probably the group I feel strongest about on the defense in the linebackers. So if you want to throw Jaden Woods in with that group, I mean, the linebacker group's even better. But yeah, defensive line, definitely some question marks. But this is the trenches where the positions that Florida got hit the hardest in terms of guys departing for the draft. I mean, you've got 3 defensive linemen and 2 offensive linemen leaving, and it's like those 2 in special teams. So outside of that, it was like Devin Moore, who was obviously a very important player, and J. Mike. So, you could kind of deal with the loss of a J. Mike more than you could deal with the loss of a Caleb Banks in a day, just because of positional scarcity. So yeah, definitely a lot of question marks. But I think this group, my last point on this, and it's something that Gerald Chapman said, he's like, this group, people are going to not know anybody's name when we play, but by midseason, they're going to know these guys' names. And like, I think that's the mentality they have to have, and be like, okay, no one's scared of us, so let's make them scared of us. Like, we have to earn that. And I think that's the mentality they're going to try and bring for this season, and we'll see how it goes.
That's an awesome line. That's a fantastic line. I think these two positions about these last 2 weeks with the offensive and defensive line, like you said, trench were the hardest between the draft and portal. I think that is certainly the biggest question mark, entering this season, certainly the biggest thing that could hold this team back. I would say I think I'm more optimistic about the defensive line than the offensive line. In spite of the fact that I think Phil Troutwine's a great coach, I think Florida just has more proven pieces, I think, on its defensive line. I think more proven pieces, and the unproven pieces, I think you can sell yourself on a little bit easier maybe than you can for the offensive line's unproven pieces. I'm curious if you agree with that, but that's kind of how I feel. Like, I think this unit's a question mark, but it's not something I am like losing sleep over, because I think it'll probably be at least fine.
I would agree. Because on the offensive line, like last week when I was trying to name starters, I struggled. I got to a point where I was like, who's it really going to be on the defensive line? I feel pretty confident about those guys that are like going to be the frontline guys. And then it's just who's going to earn the playing time alongside them. And that's really something we're going to figure out as the season goes. And definitely something to monitor, and that will bring you throughout the rest of spring and into the summer, what these coaches are saying about these players, because I think that gives us a good indicator of who, when they get mentioned in a press conference unprompted, when, they get asked, oh, who have surprised you so far? And they're like, wow, Brendan Bett has been unbelievable. I think that says a lot about how like some players can step up in those positions. So definitely something to keep an eye on. Something I'm excited about, because, sometimes it's fun to not know exactly who your main guy is going to be. And, it's not like there's a lack of talent in this room. I think there's plenty of talented players in this group, but who are going to be those talented players that step up into the bigger roles? that's what we have to see.
Yeah, fully agree. And I think we'll get a little bit more clarification in that regard. Spring goes on, just like you said, who are coaches talking about? I think that is a great indication of where guys stand, even though they're not going to give you, a depth chart in mid-March. But we'll certainly be curious to see how this group continues to develop. We really appreciate everyone watching this show. It's live right now or after the fact on YouTube, but whether you're on the go or whether video podcasts just aren't really your thing, you can also get us pretty much wherever you get your audio podcasts. We're on basically all of them. You can catch us on Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and Spotify. So whatever your favorite audio platform is, you can find Florida Gators Live and the voice of college football there. The voice of college football is also all new on Twitter right now. You can join the conversation today. We're going to be starting discussion, debate, and just getting into the sport that we all love so much. So please follow the voice of college football on Twitter. That's at the VOCFB, and join the conversation today. I think with the football stuff out of the way, I think we can kind of get into some of this March Madness talk, which I am certainly excited to do. Obviously, a bit of, mixed emotions this week, I guess, for the Gators. They do not repeat as SEC tournament champions, fall short against Vanderbilt in the SEC tournament semifinal. Played Kentucky in the first game in the quarterfinal. And I mean, frankly, that game felt like the exact same as the first two games. It basically ended up 71-63. So kind of a low scoring, bit of a sloppy win, but they controlled throughout. And then kind of just all fell apart, frankly, in the Vanderbilt game. Ended up losing by 17, 91-74. First double-digit loss of the season, trailed by, I think, as much as 24. It was really as simple as, Vandy, everyone was hitting shots, including their front court. Florida was not shooting well, which was a problem in both games over the weekend in Nashville. Also just some sloppiness in general. I think the turnover problem is again. And I'm curious to know, does that change your optimism regarding this team at all heading into this week? Obviously, Florida earns the 1 seed in the South. Will be playing the winner of tonight's game between Prairie View A&M and Lehigh. So got that 1 seed after all. But is your confidence in this team shaken at all? Because I honestly think mine might be a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah.
I could just stop there, but no, I'll go into it. I feel like I'm a cynical person. I hate being like that, but I am. It's hard not to be sometimes. And the issues that have presented themselves in all of Florida's losses this season just were very present throughout both of those games. They did not play well against Kentucky. Like straight up, they did not play well against Kentucky. They got lucky in that game because Kentucky didn't play well either. And I think that was different because I think in the first two games against Kentucky, I thought Florida played pretty well. And in this third game, I don't think they really did. There's a bunch of spots. We could start with the three-point shooting because we've talked about, from February 1st coming into this tournament, UF was 37% from three. That's a really good mark. I mean, that was if you would have told someone at the beginning of the season they'd get up to that, whoa. They were 29% until January 31st. They went 8 for 37 in the SEC tournament. So 21.6%. That's not great. Thomas Houck only hit 1 3. Isaiah Brown went 0 for 6. Clafchart only took 4. And then you've got Vanderbilt. 6 of their 3-pointers in the game were from centers. So they're just out here splash mountain, and we're a kiddie pool. And it's like, well, what do you want? We need to make threes. And it didn't help that, 18 turnovers against Kentucky. They averaged 12 a game, which is already high. It's a high number. That's not, you want it under 11 if you're really, nitpicking here. When they lost to TCU earlier in the season, they had 19 turnovers. I felt a little like deja vu with that. Like, and then, a lot of fouls, and then we didn't shoot great from the free throw line. And it's like all the issues that we've talked about. Listen, this team is going to be a tough out. I mean, we know that. This is a physical team. They're number one in rebound margin. They're the number 2 offensive rebounding team in the country. That automatically gives you a super high floor. Then you mix that with the tempo they play. They're one of the fastest teams in the country, and they've got 8 guys who can beat you. So how many other teams can say that? But is this a national championship team like last season? I'm straight up going to say it right now, no.
Mm-hmm.
I do 3 brackets every season. And I'm not, I can't be biased. I didn't pick us in any this year. I usually throw us a bone. Last year I had us in my main bracket. This year I didn't pick us in any of the 3. I will go more into the region. I think that also plays a part. I think Florida, people were saying Duke got the hardest draw. I very firmly disagree. I think the South region is very difficult because I think you've got the best 2 seed, the best 3 seed, and one or the first or second best 5 seed. So, and a team we just saw kick Florida's butt. So it's not going to be an easy path. Could Florida do it? Yes, they've got the talent, but based on those shooting and capabilities that we saw, and the turnovers, which have consistently been an issue, I just don't think this team, they would need to limit that for 6 straight games. And they kind of did in the run that we just had. But they didn't limit the turnovers as much, and there were some bad shooting nights. They weren't perfect at those aspects. So, yeah, I'm definitely not as confident. Long answer to short answer, not as confident.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I'm with you. I picked Florida to win it in my bracket last year. But have not mine yet. I need to do that tonight, but I don't think I'm going to be picking Florida. I think would that be different? Florida just kept rolling through the SEC tournament. I think so. I think just the way this. I mean, I'm not sure they're the best team, but I think they were pretty clearly the hottest team. Or maybe up there with alongside Duke, maybe. But yeah, I think it's what you said. It's the fact that these things that were such just killer problems earlier in the year kind of seemed like you had them fixed. I mean, the outside shooting was so much better. The turnovers were, like you said, not great, but they were getting them under control at least. But those 2 things both reared their head big time in those games in Nashville. And that's just a major concern. I mean, could I feel a little bit better if Florida comes out and shoots 40% on Friday against, the 16 seed? Yeah, probably. Because I think, if they get back, they can kind of heat up a little bit. I'll be like, okay, we'll see what happens. I think looking ahead to potentially Sunday, a second round game, assuming Florida does not become the third 1 seed to lose to a 16 seed, which I might just not be able to go live for a couple weeks if that happens. Yeah. I'm not going to lie. But let's assume that doesn't happen and say Florida would play the winner of 8-seeded Clemson and 9-seeded Iowa. I think they'll probably be fine against either of those. I think this team is still not a lock, but I think this team is still well positioned to get to the second weekend. But yeah, I think when you look at who else is seeded in the region, I just had that up in front of me. Oops. The 2 seed obviously being Houston, which you would play in Houston, in the Elite Eight if that matchup were to happen. So that'd be a de facto road game, even though it's technically a neutral site. And I mean, I think obviously, like you said, having Vandy as a potential Sweet 16 matchup at the 5, don't love that either. A team obviously we just saw, like you said, didn't handle it very well. 3-seeded Illinois, I think, is a good team. 4-seeded Nebraska doesn't scare me as much. I frankly think they would probably just lose to Vanderbilt in the second round, but again, we'll see. But there's some danger here. I mean, good mid-major in VCU, UNC without without one of their best players, but could still be dangerous. A&M still here in this region as a 10. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think there's danger here, and I don't feel good about Florida even getting back to the Final Four, to be quite honest. Like, I think I'd probably have them in the Elite Eight. Like I said, I haven't filled out my bracket yet, so I haven't really thought through it, but I think I could see this team getting to the Elite Eight. I think anything further, I would look back and say, wow, that team really, really was playing its best, picked a great time to start playing its best basketball.
You didn't talk about the aura, NC State or McNeese State, the aura.
That's true.
Off pure aura.
Amir Khan, is that his name?
Amir Khan, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I will say this, and we'll get in more to the matchups between kind of the 116 and then potentially the 8-9 game. We could talk a little bit about that in a minute, but Houston would suck as a matchup. It's a road game. Illinois had, for most of the season, the best adjusted offensive efficiency in the history of KenPom for like 90% of the season. So they could score like really good offensively. That's a scary team. If they make the Elite Eight, that means their defense has played well enough to get them there. And that's scary. Because you can't just outgun like Houston. Like, you have to like actually play Houston if that's who you play against. So it's definitely not the easiest path. And then obviously, you'd be playing maybe Duke, UConn, Michigan State, or St. John's in the Final Four, and then whoever you'd play in the national championship. But you've got to take it one step at a time right now. I would agree. Florida has I think a relatively good path to the Sweet 16 at minimum. They are really hoping it's not Vanderbilt there at this point. I think they don't want to play that team. I mean, the first time UF played Vanderbilt led in the last minute of the game before Xavier Lee hit that three.
Sure.
So Vanderbilt played UF, and listen, it was 2 road games practically, but like we'd be talking. Where would these? Where are the second round games? I forget.
Tampa. You're saying Vanderbilt's.
Yeah, well, no, the Sweet 16 because.
Oh, that'll be in Houston.
So, let's say 50-50 crowd. So, not a road game like the last 2 have been basically, but still, they have to get to that point. We could go into that now, but they can't just be like, yeah, we're already focused on Vanderbilt or whoever we're going to play in the Sweet 16, because if you overlook, there's one team in the 8-9 game that I think is a dangerous team, and we could get into that in a little after we talk about the 16s that are playing right now, halfway through the second half. So yeah, you want to get into those 16s now if you want.
Sure, and I'm curious to see which one you're talking about at the 8-9, because there's, I think, one team I definitely would rather play than the other, and I'm curious if we're on the same page. But yeah, so the 16 seeds, that game is ongoing now. Lehigh currently trailing to Prairie View by 4 in the second half. They were a 3.5-point favorite, according to FanDuel. Yeah, I mean, 2 16 seeds, not a ton to say. I think they both have very good guards, which is interesting. I mean, I think you kind of tend to see that in these mid-major teams. If they're getting this far, it's usually because they have a just really good guard. Prairie View, I believe, they're the lowest seed tournament. They were the 8 seed, a pretty weak major conference. Certainly, I just surprised in perspective.
Lost you at the end of that, but I know where you were going to. Your Wi-Fi has been a lot better though, which is good.
That is good.
Well, you mentioned good guards, and Lehigh has a player in Nazir Whitlock who, coming into tonight, had scored 15 plus points in his last 17 games and is averaging 21 points per game. He is 1 for 11 tonight with 3 points midway through the second half. So Lehigh's down by 6 right now as we speak, 47-41. Wonder why? When your best scorer has 1 basket, their second best player though, Hank Alvey, who's also been really hot recently, has picked up the slack, 16 points, 9 boards right now, but also has 4 turnovers. And a good these two teams play such different brands of basketball, which is why this was a really interesting game because Lehigh loves to shoot the three. They're 36.5% three-point shooting team this season. Tonight they're 5 for 18, so they're shooting the three. Prairie View has shot 7 threes tonight. That's it. That's not their game. They are a very quick-moving interior threat team. 70.9 adjusted tempo, which is number 25 in the country. So they move really quick. And Dante Horn, they've gone 9-1 in their last 10 games. He's averaging 25 points per game in that stretch. He has 17 tonight and 6 rebounds, also 4 turnovers, though. I think the reason, though, that Florida can really run away with whichever one of these two teams they play is these are two very bad rebounding teams. Like, just straight up, neither of these teams can rebound. They're number 331 and 336 in rebound rate. Florida is obviously number 1 in that statistic. And then I think if it is Prairie View, if this result holds, their fast tempo is a actual downside to them as a potential upset team, because I think Lehigh would be a worse matchup for Florida, because what Lehigh does is they play a slower game and they shoot threes effectively. And that's the recipe that Cinderella teams in the past have had, because they're not more athletic than the team they're playing, right? But they capitalize on the couple possessions they have, and they frustrate those defenses. So yeah, I'm rooting for Prairie View to pull this out. I think that's an easier matchup for Florida, but they're a hot team. Obviously, we're talking about 16 seeds here. If Florida doesn't beat these teams by at least 20, it's a disappointing game. But that's just how it is. We've seen it twice in the last decade now, a 16 beating a 1. It's not impossible like people used to think it was. It's a basketball game at the end of the day. It is a basketball game. If Florida misses every shot, doesn't matter, right? So Florida's got to figure out their deal. What are they going to shoot the ball better? Or are they just going to go, okay, we're going to go out there in the first quarter, we're going to shoot some threes. If the threes aren't falling, let's go straight interior on these weaker teams that can't rebound. Because that's what I would do game plan wise if the threes aren't falling, and then capitalize on second chance points. So, analytically, neither of these teams are great, but they do have one thing that they do well each in terms of, Prairie View has that tempo, Lehigh has the shooting. So it's going to be interesting to see who Florida ends up facing at a lovely 9:25 approximate tip-off on Friday.
In Tampa. What are we doing here, guys?
I will be there. I will be there all day for all the games, and I'm sad we are the night game. I was kind of hoping we'd do the early one so that, when I'm tired and it's like, ugh. But I mean, right before us, you've got that 8-9 match. I'm interested to see if we're thinking of the same team here that we both don't want to play, or both would rather not play. You could go into that if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. Real quick, just before we move on, just one last thing on the 16s. I mean, I think, obviously upsets can happen here. It's been proven that the 1 seeds can lose to the 16 now, but I think Florida's a really tough one to try to do that too, just because, you said it doesn't matter if Florida misses every shot. I mean, I do think Florida could come out and miss 23s in this game, and they might still just score 75, 80 points in the paint, and it won't matter because, they just have such a physicality and size and offensive rebounding advantage against these guys. So I think that's just a matchup, in particular for a 16 to pull off, regardless of how good the guard play is. Looking ahead to the 8-9, I mean, yeah, I'm curious if we agree. I think I mean, I think you could argue that Clemson is a style of team that bodes worse for Florida. But I think without Carter Welling, their big man who tore his ACL in the ACC tournament, he's done for the year. I think that really takes a lot of wind out of their sails. I don't think Clemson's good enough offensively to really compete. And I think if you're going to try to out physical Florida, one of your best big man, I think you're going to run into problems. Whereas Iowa, I mean, look, it's March, and I think a really good guard just scares me. And they have one in Bennett Sturts, one of the best in the entire country. Just a guy that could get really hot. And, maybe I'm over indexing on what I just watched on Saturday in that Vanderbilt game, but I'm just like, man, if Florida has a bad shooting night, I think as good as this team is on defense and as good as they are on the boards, I'm not sure they could overcome Sturts just dropping 32 or something like that. If Iowa plays pretty well in general outside of that.
Ding, ding, ding. We agree.
Yeah.
I do not want to play Iowa, and I think they
Yeah.
are going to play Iowa.
I do. I agree.
I just think
I agree.
so. Ben McCollum and Bennett Sturts as a pair have been together now at 3 different schools on really 3 different levels, from D2 to mid-major, now to Iowa. They're 14-4 win and go home games, which is a really impressive record. And yes, both of these teams are limping into the tournament. I mean, Iowa's 3-7 in their last 10, Clemson 4-6. They're both very methodical teams, though. This is going to be like the over-under on this. I want to go check what the over-under on this game is on FanDuel, because it's. I mean,
neither of them are top 340 in adjusted tempo.
So. Yeah, one of my favorite stats of the season is, and I wrote this down, Clemson, when they allow 65 or less points, they're 17-0. And in games where they allow more than 65, they're 7-10. So just that mark of that margin. So I'd be surprised. Yeah, it's 129.5. So they're like, is a team going to score 65 points? Yes or no? That is the question in this game. I think Iowa has the offense to score 65 points. Bennett Sturts averages 20, and this is the number 31 offense adjusted to KenPom. They're just under 36% three-point shooting team, which is a little bit better than Clemson. And like you said, the interior loss for Clemson of Carter Welling, they don't really have like that guy. Like RJ Godfrey is the leading scorer, just under 12 points per game. They've got a couple other solid players, but I also think Iowa is a very stingy defense. They average over 13 turnovers per game, which is another concern of why I think Florida could be a bad matchup against Iowa, considering that turnover margin. But this is not to say that Iowa is some juggernaut, like, oh my God, like you've got to be horrified of them this season, because if you look at Iowa schedule this season, they really have not won a big game away from home all season, I believe. So, this is a beatable team. There's a reason they're an 8, but they're definitely a stronger 8. And yeah, I'm looking at it right now. Their best road win looks like it was.
They're a 9.
Indiana.
They're the 9.
Oh, they're the 9. Yeah, Indiana in January.
Yeah,
is the only tournament team who they're not even in the tournament. They beat 0 tournament teams on the road, and they did take Nebraska to overtime on the road, and they did play Iowa State close on the road and Purdue close on the road. They're going to play Florida close if they play. This will not. It's not a blowout because of Iowa's style of play. They don't get blown out because they play such a methodical game that you can't blow them out. But I just think at the end of the day, Florida, with the de facto home advantage as well, is just too good to get bounced this early. But like we mentioned, they've got to get there I know it's like, oh, okay, they have to beat Prairie View A&M, who's going to be playing in their, first tournament game or whatever, and it's like, or second tournament game if they win tonight and making it past the first four. Still, they made March Madness. They would have been on an 8-game winning streak. You can't overlook teams like that. Teams that played their way into this tournament. Florida didn't have to do that. They were in this tournament January 7th, or early January. They were after the Vanderbilt game. It was like, okay, they're fine. So yeah, there's a lot at stake, and obviously if this team got bounced before the second weekend, that would be a huge disappointment of a season. I think everybody would agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, my line coming into the year, because they did just win a national championship, was I don't really care what happens in the tournament this year, but I'd love to get to the second weekend. I mean, obviously, I think my calculus there changed a little bit just because I think it became clear that, I think in some ways, this team felt more sustainable than last year's because it doesn't rely so much on someone like Walter Clayton just absolutely catching fire, or at least someone in the backcourt absolutely catching fire. But yeah, I mean, I think Florida will be at a pretty sizable advantage against any of these four teams. I don't think any of them are really built to beat Florida. I think I agree that Iowa's the one I'd least want to play. I mean, the 16 game, I'll just say, Florida's not going to lose that game, but if they go out there and, win by 18 points in a slog and they shoot 5 of 23 from 3, I'll be like, I am not loving this. I'll probably not be feeling great about trajectory for the rest of the tournament. I think they probably will get past Iowa or Clemson as well. I think real challenges are going to start in the second weekend, just because I think that's when you'll start to see teams that have really a lot of outside shooting threats, the size and physicality to, go toe to toe, with Florida. Because I mean, even in the Vanderbilt game, the rebounding was not the problem. But
no.
It kind of was everything else. So I think we'll see, but I think certainly a tough path. And I don't think by any means a given that Florida is still playing basketball after this weekend, though I would say I feel pretty confident that they will be.
Yeah. The most comparative team pace wise to these two teams that Florida has played in, and it would be a kind of jump from going to, if they do play Prairie View, a really quick team, into playing a very methodically based team, is Tennessee. Kind of plays that same style. But, when you look at the rebounding numbers, Tennessee's a much better rebounding team than an Iowa or a Clemson. Clemson and Iowa are very middle of the pack rebounding teams. So Florida shouldn't struggle on the boards against those teams. It's when, the second most methodical team in the country based on pace this season is Houston, right? So you look at how Houston plays, and if Florida can show, they're not stiffed by a team that can play that pace of game, I think that says a lot about a potential matchup with Houston if they get to that point. But for all those people looking for Cinderellas, I'm telling you, the slower teams, the slower pace of play is an advantage, because a lot of these teams are used to just tempo, especially Florida playing in the SEC. Alabama, when you play Alabama, they're running up and down the court. They're not waiting for you. Texas A&M is not waiting for you. Kentucky's not waiting for you. Florida's not waiting for you. That's the type of basketball Florida plays this season, is a lot faster than they did last season. So it's definitely stylistically an interesting matchup, whoever they play in the second round. And I'm not counting out Clemson, because Brad Brownell's been there 16 years. He's made runs to the Elite Eight. I was a big fan of them going to the tournament last year. They looked god awful in the first round against McNeese. I've maybe never seen a team offensively play worse. They had 12 points at half, but I ended up in the Sweet 16 last year. So I guess, I'm the idiot, but, I'm the idiot who could still see them winning a game and potentially being an annoying team to play against. And that's the thing. Whoever this matchup is going to be, it's not a fun matchup. You're either
No.
going up against a very veteran led team or an all American point guard and a really, really, really fundamentally good basketball team.
Yeah, rarely is a fun matchup on Saturday. Like, I mean, I think, people I think it's easy to forget, even when you're a really high seed, like, this tournament gets tough real quick. I mean, Florida's second round last year was a brutal game to watch.
Yeah.
Back-to-back defending champion and had the Gators on the absolute ropes. So, I don't think anyone is going to take anything for granted, certainly going into this weekend. And yeah, I mean, if it's Clemson, if they get the win, which, I mean, even though I think we both think Iowa's the tougher team, I don't think it would surprise me at all if Clemson won, because I think Clemson is more suited to beat Iowa than they are to beat Florida. So I think, you're more likely to see, you could easily see them win that game. And if they do, I mean, even without Welling, they still have some size. They're still a good defensive team. They still rebound the ball pretty well. So, they do some things that, they can kind of do, I don't know if they can beat Florida at their own game, but they can, I think, be competitive. So yeah, either way, tough, but should be a fun weekend. March Madness is always fun. It's even more fun when the Gators are in it and have a chance. So thank you, Todd Golden, for that.
Yeah, one more point I just want to make, because you kind of brought it up on how hard that matchup was last season in the second round against UConn. And then Florida's path last year was extremely difficult. Like, I don't want, I'm talking about how they got stiffed with the region this year. They had a hard region last year. So it's not, Texas Tech and Maryland were not easy game. Like, Maryland was the best 4 seed last year. Like, Vanderbilt's the best 5 seed. Like, they had a ball dominant center and they were really good defensively. And yeah, like, Florida had to pull out all the stops to win those games. And that's the thing about Todd Golden is, I say I'm not that confident, yada, yada, yada. At the end of the day, this team is so well coached that they can game plan for whatever. And if you really look at statistically, Florida didn't play horribly against Vanderbilt. The shots just weren't falling, and Vanderbilt's shots were falling, and that was the difference in the game. The turnovers aside, it was the shooting, and then it was, some bad fouls and, some questionable ones if you want to go there. But you can't control that in games. So you can only control what you could control. Florida, I'm sure, has put in countless hours just shooting this week and focusing there, and just play smart basketball. And when you play smart basketball and you're the better team, which Florida is going to be the better team in every matchup they play up until arguably the Elite Eight, if they play Houston, they are the better team. Play like the better team. Play fundamentally sound basketball, rebound the ball, make open shots, and don't turn the ball over. I mean, you don't got to make every 3. Just make 1 out of every 3 threes and get rebounds and kick it back out. Then if you shoot more 3s, then you make more 3s usually. So we'll see next week. Hopefully Florida's still kicking it. And then we'll talk. We'll know what the path to the Final Four would solidly look like at that point. And based on how Florida plays over the next, couple games, if they're still in, well, I think we'll have a more definitive picture next week. And if not, we'll be coming on and be sad next week, which would be very fun.
That would be very sad. Hopefully that is not what happens. I think we're gonna get out of here in a few minutes and watch some basketball, because this game, could end up being interesting. And obviously, I'm really excited to see what happens in that late game with Miami, Ohio, and SMU. That should be interesting. Before we get out of here, we could talk maybe a little baseball and softball real quick. Baseball 3-0 to start SEC play. Nice home series win against South Carolina. Kind of a weird series. Friday night, they were getting no hit until the 9th inning. We're ultimately able to walk that one off in the 10th. I'll be honest, I didn't get to watch a lot of these games. I was at a wedding this past weekend, so kind of had to catch up after the fact. But another shutout, 3-0 win on Saturday against with Aiden King still not having given up an earned run, I believe. 13-3. So last time. The road. I mean, bad, but one of the sir, you know,
losing you bad. Losing you bad, I'll be honest. About halfway into that. But
okay.
It's all good. I talked so much smack about this bullpen last week, and they made me eat my words this week because they didn't give up a run. All weekend long, they didn't give up one run. So, shoot, I mean, good job, guys. I wasn't expecting 2 shutouts, and Cooper Walls got hit a little bit hard, but the offense showed up on Sunday, and Luke McNeely was pretty awesome in his relief appearance. Ernesto Lugo Conchola with some scoreless ball, Jackson Barberi with some scoreless ball, Josh Rittenauer with some scoreless ball, a couple walks, but you could forgive that. I mean, Liam Peterson was lights out. Aiden King was lights out. They combined for 19 strikeouts and 3 allowed hits in 12 innings combined. It's pretty good. And then, while the bats were quiet on the first 2 days, they wake up in style in that second game. And Cash Strayer, 5 RBIs. He, hits a 3-run homer, or sorry, not a 3-run. He hits a grand slam in the 4th inning. So yeah, definitely, the depth scoring has been nice as well, especially in that Sunday game. So we'll see, beginning of SEC play and two shutouts to start and a mercy rule 3rd game. What else can you really ask for? We'll see how they do against Alabama, because that's not an easy series, but yeah, I'm excited. A little bit of a better look recently, and then they get the win over Stetson yesterday, so that's nice. Forgot that game happened, I'll be honest.
No, kind of a start, but ended up pulling away pretty easily there. And then softball also got the sweep this weekend, right, against Kentucky.
Yep.
So they're top 5, top 10 team, depending where you look. They've had a really impressive start to the year. Obviously, things are going to ramp up once they start playing some of the better teams in the SEC. But I think reasons to be optimistic about both of these squads as we're kind of at the roughly midpoint of the season.
Yeah, I mean, Jocelyn Erickson, obviously 2 years ago, was one of the best players in college softball, and then she comes out and she's already hit her career high in homers, and we're not even halfway through the season. So she already has 16 home runs. She's been ridiculous. Taylor Schumacher gets on base every time. It's both of those players with at least a 575 on base percentage, and they're both slugging over 950. Shoot, like, what else do you want? Like, Jocelyn Erickson's OPS is 1668. I mean, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. And there was questions about the pitching with Ava Brown going down, and then Caitlin Oxley, who got hit hard against UCLA in the only loss so far this season for Florida. She comes out on Saturday against Kentucky and pitches the entire game and only gives up 2 hits and strikes out 7. So, that's the kind of performance you want to see from her in a bounce back. And the first time she touched the mound since that UCLA game. So, yeah, I mean, if Florida's depth pitching could pick up while Ava Brown is out for however long she is out, that would be really, really big, uh, obviously, for the Gators going forward.
Yep, no doubt, no doubt. So certainly interesting to see, as we get a little further, the teams that been to get back to Oklahoma City, respectively. But I think with that, there's March Madness on. My internet is hanging on by a thread, so I think we'll probably cut it right about here. But really appreciate everyone tuning in live, everyone watching after the fact. Remember, like, comment, subscribe on YouTube, and if again, if audio is more your thing, find us on your favorite audio podcast platform. We're there as well. So really appreciate everyone tuning in. It will be fun to see what happens in March Madness this weekend, and hopefully we're previewing the Sweet 16 when we see you guys next week. So thanks for tuning in, and until next time, go Gators.